ahead of time. If you would like, I will pre-record little 15 to 20 minute segments of the book of Daniel until Daniel is done. I'll then have it set up here for you all, and you can listen to me lecture for 15 to 20 minutes and then talk about it after that. I would still need somebody, obviously, to kind of ask questions and to get discussion going. But I am willing to do that at least through the end of the book of Daniel so that you're finished on that subject when I move to before you find a new teacher altogether. So that's just something to think about, something to pray about. You can tell me what you think about that. I would be very interested in at least finishing the book of Daniel, because the book of Daniel is a pretty interesting book. And so I wouldn't mind doing that. That wouldn't be a problem. It doesn't take me long to throw together a lecture. And so we can do that.
One of the sermons I heard this morning was on Daniel.
Oh, really? Yep. Good book, but tough book to tackle in a sermon, I think. Yep, but good. Alrighty, thanks so very much for those online with us. I appreciate you all coming. Thanks so very much for coming back. I appreciate it. Today we're looking to start the book of Daniel, chapter 7. And today the objective is to know God's power over the nations. We're going to be looking at Daniel chapter 7, specifically verses 1 through 8, which is only one segment of the vision that Daniel has. The vision actually runs through verse 14, and then in verse 15, the interpretation starts. So, that being said, today I think I would like to focus on just describing what we see in the vision. All right, and if you want to go into interpretation, we can a little bit, but that's actually reserved for later on. And so let's start tackling Daniel chapter 7, verses 1 through 8. Could I have one person read that for us, please?
In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying on his bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. Daniel said, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven, churning up the great sea. Four great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion, and it had wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a man, and the heart of a man was given to it. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, 'Get up and eat your fill of flesh.' After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth that spoke boastfully."
Excellent. Thank you so much. So this is where we're heading into. We're going to be describing and talking about this vision, making sure that we understand the different components, and then we'll see if we ever get into interpretation. Let's start with verse 1, though. What do we see as a time stamp for this dream? We mentioned this very briefly at the end last week. What do we see as a time stamp for the dream? Yeah, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. So the Persian Empire has not conquered Babylon yet. We've gone back in time, right? So we're going to be dwelling, this vision takes place somewhere in the realm of Daniel chapter 5. It's actually before Daniel chapter 5, because Daniel chapter 5 talks about like the last day of King Belshazzar's reign. This is going to be before that. Right? So this vision that we have is we're going backwards in chronological time. Okay? Great. What does Daniel see? Still in verse 1.
Saw a dream.
Yeah, he saw a dream in visions of his head as he lay on his bed, right? Saw dreams and visions. Now, he knows enough that he knows that this is not an ordinary dream. This is not an ordinary vision. This is something specific and special coming to him from God, which is why he writes it down, right? He writes it down and tells the sum of the matter. Good. Anything else that you see there in verse 1?
But if you ever dream and you wake up and in another hour, maybe you never even remember what you dreamed. But there is some dreams that stays with you for a long time, and those are important, I think.
Sure. Oh, interesting. Very good. So the insight here is that most of the time when we dream, we wake up and an hour later we've forgotten it. There are some dreams that maybe stick with us. Perhaps those are important. Yeah, very good.
I had a dream before my father died, and the dream was about him dying. And it just stayed with me for quite a while.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. I think dreams that maybe touch chords of emotion in us kind of stick with us longer. Yeah. Mhm. All right, let's take a look then. And by the way, the scholars will say this. So the first year of King Belshazzar, king of Babylon, is somewhere between 552 and 549 BC. Okay, that's about the estimate that we're talking about here. That means it's approximately 50 years since the exile. So you're talking about the exile. How old is Daniel in the exile? Yeah, probably a teenager, somewhere between the ages of 16 and 20, right? He's not yet a man. He's probably 16 to 18, somewhere in there. So we're talking 50 years later. How old is he?
65.
Yeah, he's in his mid-60s, right? Before he begins to have these sorts of dreams and interpretations. And he's been a faithful, obedient Jew all of those years, right? So the comment that Joyce Baldwin makes on page 153 is this: God reserves much for age and experience. God reserves much for age and experience. And that's something important to have in the back pocket for us. Okay? You don't have it? It's all right. You can put it in your purse or wherever. Yeah. All right. Daniel chapter 7, verse 2. What do we see? What's Daniel see? That's the real question.
The four winds of heaven.
Excellent. We see four winds of heaven doing what?
Stirring up the great sea.
Stirring up the great sea. You got it. What is, well, let's just go in order. What do you all think the four winds of heaven are? What does it mean?
Well, there's another reference, because I've read another one that says the four winds of heaven, but I don't remember where it's at.
Yeah, excellent. Here you'd be probably thinking about like Zechariah 2:6.
Okay.
So let me read that for us. I went the wrong way in my Bible. Zechariah 2:6 says, Up, up, flee from the land of the north, declares the Lord, for I have spread you abroad as the four winds of the heavens, declares the Lord. Okay, and so there's another reference to four winds of heaven. Okay.
It's also in Revelation. The four angels hold back the four winds.
Sure. In Revelation also, the four angels hold back the four winds. You got it. And that would be marking forward. Daniel is extremely important for the entirety of the New Testament, actually. And one of the places where it has its biggest influence is in the book of Revelation. And so that would be a pulling forward there for us. You got it. So what are the four winds of heaven, or what does it mean?
My footnote says this portrays the world's chaotic condition.
Okay, excellent. Actually, so that would be the entirety of the verse. That would be the understanding and meaning of the entirety of the verse. The four winds of heaven stirring up the great sea. That would imply the chaotic nature of the whole world. Yeah, absolutely. So four winds of heaven. What are the four compass points?
North, south, east, and west.
North, south, east, and west, right? That's basically what they're talking about there with four. Okay, it's north, south, and east, and west, the four winds, so to speak. This would basically mean the wind in every direction, and four, compromising the four compass points, is basically talking about the whole earth. Okay? So again, we're coming back to the where do we get the whole earth from in Alona's footnote? Well, the whole earth, that's where they're getting it from. It's the symbolic representation of the four winds of heaven. Okay, or the four winds, the four winds of heaven. The four compass points. It means the totality, the completeness of. Let's just take a quick moment here. And let's just remember that dreams are usually highly symbolic. So he is actually seeing this, but there's a point to the dream. There's an interpretation. There's a meaning to the dream. Let's take some more simple examples just to get our feet wet here. What are the dreams that Joseph interprets for people when he's stuck in Egypt in the prison? There's 3 specific dreams he interprets. Does anybody remember what those are?
One is for the butler, and one is for the baker.
Yeah, one's for the butler, one's for the baker. And we should throw in the candlestick maker there, but it's not the candlestick maker. Third one is Pharaoh, right? So absolutely. So what's the one for the butler? The butler is actually the person wine pressing, right? And what does he see in the dream? He sees, well, I see a hand pressing wines into the cup, and he serves it to Pharaoh, and he says, hey, in 3 days you'll be restored to Pharaoh. And the other guy says, well, actually what I see a basket, and the birds are coming and eating the bread out of the basket. What does he say? He says, in 3 days, Pharaoh will lift you up. He'll lift your head from your body, and the birds will feast on your head. Right? You see immediately there's this dream, but there's symbolism there. It's symbolic. It's standing for something else. And Joseph has the wisdom to see what the dream means. Right? And he's given that interpretation from God. What's the dream for Pharaoh? See 7
fat cows and 7 lean cows.
Yeah. I see 7 fat cows, and they're grazing and they're munching happily. And then out of the river come 7 sickly cows who consume the 7 healthy cows, yet they don't get any bigger themselves. Then he says the same thing with the grain, right? Well, what does it mean? Well, actually the 7 cows and the 7 heads of grain are standing for 7 years. And then the interpretation is that famine is coming, right? So those are more simple things, but the dreams are symbols and they stand for other things. It's the same thing here. Yes, Daniel is literally seeing in a vision the 4 winds of heaven stir up the sea. But that doesn't mean that actually the 4 winds of heaven are going to stir up the Pacific Ocean, cause a hurricane. That is not talking about that, right? It's standing for something else. It means something else. Okay, so we've got to get that all together. Yes, he literally sees it, but no, it doesn't mean what it literally says. It's symbolic. It's figurative. It stands for something else. So we see the 4 winds of heaven stirring up what? In Daniel chapter 7, verse 2.
Would it be the Mediterranean Sea?
Yeah, great. So the Great Sea usually stands for the Mediterranean Sea. but we shouldn't make it or force it be the Mediterranean Sea because it doesn't say that. It's simply a great ocean. It could be the Mediterranean, maybe not. What it usually stands here for, is the sea is probably standing for the mythic sea. Okay? It's symbolic of what? And here's the question then. What does the sea usually mean for ancient Jews?
Population of the world.
What's that?
The population of the world.
Yeah, it can stand for the population of the world or the nations. Good. So that's one meaning for it. What else is there? Let me see if I have that for us. Turn with me to Isaiah 57. Isaiah 57, verse 20. Isaiah 57:20. Would one person like to read that for us?
But the wicked are like the tossing sea which cannot rest, whose waves cast up mire and mud.
Excellent. Very good. Thank you. So there the wicked is compared to the sea. So if you have something that's a symbolism, the sea could stand for the people, the world, the nations, right? It could stand for population. There's one other reference I have marked here. It's Psalm 107. Psalm 107, verses 23 through 29. This is partly what the Lord has command over. Okay? So it's talking about what the Lord has command over. Can somebody read for me Psalm 107, verses 23 through 29?
Those who go down to the sea in ships, who do business on great waters, they see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep. For he commands and raises the stormy wind, which lifts up the waves of the sea. They mount up to the heaven. They go down again to the depths. Their soul melts because of trouble. They reel to and fro and stagger like a drunken man and are at their wits' end. Then they cry out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brings them out of their distresses. He calms the storm so that its waves are still. Keep going.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yep, verse 29. Thank you. So there we see that who has control over the waters? The Lord does. So when we're coming back to this dream and this symbolism, we know that yes, there is a great sea, but the Lord is going to be king over it. By the way, who else stills the waters in the Bible?
Jesus.
Jesus. Isn't that fascinating? So ever since I've saw that point in that Psalm 107, I just write that in the margin every time I go through the gospel. You know, oh, Psalm 107, yep. Another indication of the Lord's divinity. Why do the disciples, after Jesus stills the waters and walks out to the boat, with them, and they say, who is this that can still even the waters? Well, they're thinking of Psalm 107 in their heads. Only God can do that. And here's Jesus whispering to the waters, okay? So, that gives us a good indication of what the sea is. Does anybody know what mythic monster dwells in the sea for the ancient Israelites? Leviathan. You got it. Leviathan dwells in the water. Sometimes Leviathan is called Rahab, right? And there's only one person who can still Rahab, and that's God himself, right? Leviathan. By the way, do we have any mythic monsters in our day and age? Anybody want to?
Monster.
Loch Ness Monster. Fascinating, right? Yeah. What else?
How about Bigfoot?
Bigfoot. You got it. Right? Bigfoot, the Yeti. Anybody, one from my neck of the woods, anyone heard of the Jersey Devil? Oh, he has body of a man, but long teeth, wings, and a tail coming out. He's covered in blue when he comes, and he'll eat your chickens and take your goats right. It's something in Weird, New Jersey. That's literally the name of the town. It's Weird, New Jersey, right? How about anyone travel down towards North Carolina, going Delaware? You always see the Mothman. Right? We have the Mothman. Every culture has its stories. The ancient Israelites had theirs too. Leviathan is included in that. Okay? But Leviathan then indicated something profound to them, because many of our stories indicate something profound about our culture. Has anybody heard of zombies? Vampires? What do those indicate about our culture? An extreme fear of death. An angst over death. And you know what then happens? We have people trying to live forever. Right? We just want to keep prolong the life as long as possible. We have doctors who will not allow you to die unless you tell them you want to die. Right? They'll hook you up to machines. They'll keep you going. Right.
We had one doctor on our floor, and he just would do anything to keep somebody alive.
Yep.
And one time he kept this lady alive, and her life was miserable the rest of her time.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I was in on that, so
Yep. Well, I mean,
I saw her, but she was gone, but he determined that she wasn't.
the doctors have to take that stance. That's their job. Right? Their job is to keep people alive. And I'm not saying anything bad about doctors. Please do not hear me saying that. I'm just saying that that's their job. That's their role, is they to keep people alive.
When I wanted them to let my husband die because he was in such a miserable condition,
Yeah.
the doctor says, we can't do this. We take somebody to surgery. We keep him alive as long as we can.
Right.
But the chaplain came in later, and I think he convinced him that was my wish.
Sure.
Yeah.
Good.
But I was surprised when they said, I said, well, let him go. You know he can't get any better.
Yeah. I'm surprised they didn't just go with that. They're not allowed to. They're not supposed to say no to the person. But, okay. So then let's come back then to Leviathan. Leviathan is the sea monster of the deep. Okay? I mean, untamable. What then does that also express about the ancient Israelites? They have a deep-seated fear of the sea. Tremendous fear of the sea. There is only one time in which the Jews became seafaring. And Solomon built all these ships. Guess what happened to them? They were wrecked. They were all destroyed in the storm, and from then on, they didn't try to go out to sea. Have you ever wondered why in Revelation chapter 21 it says, I look and behold the new heaven and the earth, and the sea was no more? Or is God really ticked at the fish? Right? What do they ever do? No, it's not. It's talking about something deep-seated. The sea is a deep place of fear and chaos, which is why it so accurately represents humanity. Because guess what humans are? Chaotic, wicked, right? So when we're reading here, the four winds of heaven are stirring up the great sea. What we're talking about is the whole, back to Alona's footnote, the whole earth is in turmoil. The people are going everywhere. And what happens in the midst of this history? That's what the vision's going to tell us. What's going to be happening in the midst of history. Verse 3, what do we see? I'm sorry, let me pause, because I think I was lecturing for a long time. What comments or questions or insights do you have? All right, let's head up into verse 3 then. What do we see in verse 3?
4 beasts come up out of the sea, different from one another.
Excellent, you got it. 4 beasts coming up out of the sea, different from each other, right? So it's 4 things. We're not quite sure what these things are. We have to wait till verse 15 and 17 and 18 to figure out what they are. But there's these 4 things that come up out of the sea. Okay? Again, 4 is representing what? What's that? The nations, right? Completeness. It's something that's going to be over the whole world. Okay? Good. What questions do you have? Or what comments?
Does that mean that there's a one that comes out of every wind?
Is there one that comes out of every wind? The text doesn't explicitly say that.
Uh-huh.
Yep. So if we wanted to be like, well, is there going to be a kingdom in the north, south, east, and west?
Uh-huh.
Too literal there.
Uh-huh.
Text doesn't go there. Mhm. All right. Let's hit up verse 4 and we'll start to talk about some interesting things. Can I have one person reread verse 4 for us, please?
The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it.
Excellent, thank you. So there's several things we need to know. We want to be able to understand what this thing is. And then second, we also want to understand what reaction this would have caused for the Jews. What sort of reaction do you think a Jew would have to a hybrid creature? A lion and eagle's wings. Remember way back, reach back into our Leviticus series in 2015, 2016. It's been a long time, I know. Reach back. What do the Jews have? They have a list of clean animals and unclean animals, don't they? They're very, very pure, right? You don't mate with animals if you're a human. You don't crossbreed animals, okay? You keep them separate. Why? That's the way God designed them. You don't mix your different threads of cloth together. You keep it pure. It's all of one type of cloth. Okay? It's pure. The way God made it. Okay? So when they're seeing this symbol, these symbols and sorts of things would have been all over the place in Babylon. These sorts of hybrid creature things. They would have had images and pictures of them all over the place. But to a Jew, it would have been deeply revolting and deeply fearful. Okay? Deeply revolting and deeply fearful. This is not something God has made. Right? That's the idea. This is something that's gonna come out from humans. Okay? Also then, just a short while later, about 200 or 300 years later after this vision, hybrid creatures used to symbolize demonic forces. Each animal was fierce and deformed in some way, but they would represent demonic forces. Does anybody else remember what recent discussion we've had about that? When we talked about Nebuchadnezzar losing his mind, having these different features of different animals, well, one of the things that would have expressed was demonic influence over him. Okay? So we're thinking that this is something that is not necessarily of God. Although what we're going to see is that God has the power over the nations. So verse 4, lion with eagle's wings. Anybody read up on Harry Potter recently?
I don't read Harry Potter.
What beast is this? This is a griffin. Okay? Got the lion, its body. Whether it's a lion's head or an eagle's head is, up for debate. You have the lion's paws and you got the eagle's wings. That's a griffin. Y'all need to read Lord of the Rings and stuff a little bit more. Come on now. This be a griffin, folks. And so what are you seeing is a griffin. It's a lion with eagle's wings. We have a name for that. It's called a griffin. What happens to this griffin?
The wings are plucked off,
The wings are plucked off. Then what happens?
and he's lifted up,
Lifted up to do what?
stand.
Stand like a man. And then what happens?
It's a man's heart.
He gets a man's heart, right? So, what's the big deal with plucking off the eagle's wings?
You can't go nowhere.
Well, that's true. It can't roam as far, right? But symbolically, remember at the beginning of the discussion, what we were talking about was the necessity for purity. Ripping off the eagle's wings gives it just the lion body remaining, meaning it's more pure, it's more clean. Actually, lions were unclean, but it's more like God intended it to be, right? It's losing its deformed nature. And it's made to stand on 2 feet like a man. Think this is a punishment, or do you think it's a benefit? Is it a blessing or a punishment?
Blessing.
Yeah, excellent. It's actually a blessing. Why? Because man is made in the image of God and is the pinnacle of God's creation. To become more like a man is a blessing. So instead of being this griffin beast, it's more like a man. All right.
Does a man have a different kind of a mind than a woman? My son says so.
So here we're confusing terms. The ESV is using man as in the old days, like man just stands for human being.
Okay.
We have 5 minutes, so I'm not going to take the bait on that one. I'm going to leave that one on the shelf, that question on the shelf. I'm sorry, I'm going to leave that question on the shelf for you, Doris. If you ask it again next week, I'll actually tackle it. But for now, we'll just let that one go. All right, so they're standing on 2 feet like a man. The mind of man was given to it. What does that sound like? Whose story does that actually sound like?
Adam.
Not quite. Who was like a beast and then who had the mind of a man, then had the mind of a beast, and then was given the mind of a man again? Nebuchadnezzar, right? This is meant to be poking Nebuchadnezzar into our brains, okay? So we're to be thinking about him when we're seeing that. What questions or comments do you have for us? All right, here are some things that the scholars will say, and they have a list of verses that we're not going to get into today. But the lion, the eagle depicts dominion and strength. That's from Joyce Baldwin. John Goldingay will say this: the lion has ferocity, strength, is destructive, has courage, has rhapsody, which means seizing prey and not letting go, is fearsome and suggests kingship. Who else is called a lion in the Bible? Jesus, right? He's the lion of the tribe of Judah, and he's king, right? So lion expresses kingship. Eagle has speed and rhapsody. Again, that rhapsody, I had to look it up. Rhapsody means either greed or seizing hold of prey and not letting go. So that's the idea there. And he says that, that's all that he says about the eagle. So that there's meant to be then understanding here. And this is what Nebuchadnezzar was like and his kingdom. Right? It was a very strong kingdom. Under Nebuchadnezzar, Babylonians were at their pinnacle, at their peak, at their fiercest. What questions or comments do you have there? All right. Something to indicate for us. Who makes this beast? Who plucks the beast's wings off, lifts it up from the ground, and makes it stand on 2 feet like a man? Who's the only one able to do that? God, right? Again, God's power over nations. God's power over nations. Right? So that's what we're meant to see in the text. Very good. Let's tackle one more. The next, let's not tackle one more. We'll do the next one more next week. Yep. What closing questions or comments do you have for us? Now, if you want to read ahead, again, the interpretation starts in verse 15. But right now, what we're doing is we're just trying to understand the vision context and what it means, because as we're going to see, there may be a lot more here than just what's interpreted. Okay.
Just in verses 1 through 8, it seems like this first beast becomes changed and advanced a lot more than the other three, although we haven't talked about the other three. But
Yeah, so the first one becomes more advanced than the other three. Is that what you're saying?
yes, I mean, standing on 2 feet and
Yeah.
standing like a human and getting a human heart, the other three don't.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right in that observation. Great observation. Joyce Baldwin writes this. She says, world rulers glimpse through the thin veil of imagery all inspire terror. The more so history progresses, the worst is reserved for the end. So it's not a surprise that the first beast is more advanced than the others. She also writes this: the writer of the dream is not encouraged to see progress in evolutionary history, but rather the reverse. You know how we have all this notion of progress in human history? We're progressing, we're getting better. And the writer of Daniel stoutly says, no. You may think it. No. It's getting progressively worse. Right. Now, if that might... Let me leave you with a little nugget so we can come back in a few weeks and talk about this more. Here's the little nugget to hold out before us. The question is, does this cycle repeat throughout history, or is it always just in one direction? Do a lot of nations start out good and then get worse?
History repeats itself.
History tends to repeat itself. So now we're gonna be in this interesting phase, because the scholars are going to want to identify these 4 beasts with kingdoms in history, and that's great. But then the question is, well, does it happen again? It seems to. It seems to happen and happen. It seems to be typology, right? And then at the end, Revelation, God's going to reveal something to John, and how many beasts are there in John? There's Satan. Then there's the first beast, then there's the second beast, but those have different meanings to them. And so we'll come back and see how all that works out. All right, thanks so much. We'll talk to you later. Or hope to see you upstairs. Yep, thank you so much.